Hello everyone. I'm Raquel Gutierrez, and this is day 5 of the MoPop conference, the digital edition. We are on deck today with the Archives of Youth. So we have 7 participants, and beginning our session will be Emily Gale with a presentation titled "Stolen Youth, Orphan Songs, and Abolition." Take it away, Emily.
Hi, everyone. Did you want us to give a short kind of summary of our video presentations? Is that the idea? Sorry.
This is, I think that'd be helpful. Yes, yeah.
Okay, greetings all. Thanks for joining. The presentation that I worked on for this conference was about the 19th century singer Abby Hutchinson, who sang with the Hutchinson Family Singers. They were abolitionist quartet who performed throughout the 1840s. And Abby joined her brothers in this quartet singing at the age of 12. So I was interested in the idea of her kind of youthful performances. And specifically the idea of her singing songs about orphans. Orphan songs were especially popular during the 19th century. And so I wanted to think about the idea of orphan, not just in the sense of parentless youth, but the idea of neglect and how this kind of factors into the experiences of what Wilma King refers to as stolen childhoods of enslaved youths. Yeah, how's that?
Should I go next, or do we want to talk about each paper individually, or do a group discussion?
Oh, yeah. I'm getting a note here. I think it would be ideal. Eric Weisbart here in the chat. Is effective in the panel they did when panelists could speak to one another. And so, is that? I think that I invite everyone to speak to one another. Yeah. Okay. Great.
I'm going to go for it because I had a question about Emily's paper, which is probably a very simplistic question. I loved your paper, by the way. I was just wondering, what was the draw in the 19th century of orphan songs? Because I was trying to think of sort of modern versions of that, and I couldn't really, which doesn't mean they don't exist, but like with Rebecca's paper, we have this kind of pattern throughout generations of nostalgia, but I couldn't think of a modern version of an orphan song. So I was wondering kind of why those were popular, or if you know.
Well, I think it had to do in general with the kind of pervasiveness of death in the 19th century and the kind of mortality rates, rampant disease. Yeah, so certainly the kind of pervasiveness of death has to do with the relationship to the popularity of the idea of the orphan song. If you're interested, I actually did do one of my radio shows was on the topic of orphan songs, and I opened the show with Gillian Welch's rendition of the Orphan Girl. So there are some kind of contemporary examples that we could kind of draw a line through, but yeah, certainly probably not quite as pervasive today, and in some ways kind of relegated to more of a folk realm. Yeah.
Although I might add that, maybe we don't have orphan songs per se, but there's a whole slew of narratives associated with children losing parents. Like it's just pervasive. And I have a 9-year-old son, and it just feels like every single time we choose to watch anything from Disney or elsewhere, it's just the child is losing a parent. So it's still very much part of the conversation as adults look back on childhood and recreate childhoods. They're thinking about death of adults and their parents.
I wanted to just pop in, and maybe this is because I just came from the wonderful Lana Del Rey roundtable, but thinking about the sort of a persona of extreme vulnerability being a powerful tool that we see carried through, especially femme presenting pop artists, might be something to think about in terms of like the position that an artist takes when having a voice, for example. So that might be something at play. I feel like vulnerability and catharsis came up a lot in a lot of our papers in this particular setting.
Yeah, definitely thinking about the work I'm doing with this, 76-year-old woman who's recounting her past and how vulnerable she has to be to talk about the abuse of her childhood, to talk about being sort of marginalized in the rock and roll world as a woman and as a Black woman, and how when I took on this project, for her, the most important thing was being able to finally tell her story, to come out from the shadows and to have a voice, and trying to do that voice justice, but also being so worried about what she says and how sort of those with power in the music industry will take her experiences or her perceptions of what she's experienced and lived. And so, yeah, definitely. I think that's a very astute sort of perspective you're pointing.
I had a question for you related to just how Alvenia Bridges really got to be so central to the industry, because you whetted our appetite so much for that story, and I think that's what you achieved your goal for sure. So so if you could talk a little bit more about sort of like how she got into the industry, I'd love to hear that.
It's so interesting. I have the rough draft of the memoir now, and I often ask that because it seems so serendipitous how she arrived there, right? It seemed like she would just put herself out there, and she had no plan to get into the music industry. She started off in Kansas and made her way to LA, and from a chance encounter ended up in Europe, and so was this low-level model in Italy in the 60s, right, which was already pretty incredible as this Black woman in the 60s. And then she landed in New York, and her hairdresser was a hairdresser, James Finney, to people like Roberta Flack. And so she just put it out there. She was like, I don't have a job now, I'm here in New York, she told Finney, I'm on the loose, just put that out there. And the next time that Roberta Flack was in his chair, he mentioned this woman, and Roberta took a chance on her, and that's how she got her foot in the door. And from there, got to be known in the business and ended up with the Stones and some other people. But yeah, serendipity is sort of the key word there. But I had a question for everyone on the panel. I was just very curious about your positionality with the work you're doing. How did you end up doing the type of research you're doing? What really attracted you to that research?
I'll go. So this started a long time ago. So I did the presentation about the Frank Sinatra fans, and I was back a while ago. I was more interested in. I'm interested in sound technology and how technology mediates meaning and that kind of thing. So I was mostly looking at microphone technology. And so I was looking at how microphones were used for different things during World War II, including Frank Sinatra and then a few other things. And then by total accident, I was on the online archives of the Hoboken Historical Museum, which is where Frank Sinatra is from. And I found one of the fan club newsletters, and I saw it, and I was just, I couldn't even believe it. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. These fan club newsletters, which were written, published, distributed entirely by pretty much only teenage girls. So that just blew my mind. And that's what I've been on from then on. But that is kind of a feeling I got from all of our presentations, a common theme that seemed really cool to me, at least, and maybe this is obvious to say this, but we're all working in these existing narratives that exist in music history or media history or whatever, and then we're kind of bringing out these new voices And I was thinking that, especially because I think of that in a historical, 1940 sense. And then like with Olivia's presentation about students making mixtapes and sort of saying why they chose those songs today. I know this is absolutely not the point of that exercise, Olivia, but I just kept thinking, this seems like such an interesting source that we could use, like in reception studies or just music history studies, down the road, like finding these, this isn't the primary narrative of these songs that, mass media knows, but here's how it's being used in this particular moment, this particular place. And I just thought that was kind of a cool theme throughout. I think I got off track of the question. The original question was, how did you all get into your topics?
Do we want to go in order? Maybe keep that going, right? Okay, so Katie, you were after Emily, Maya. Maybe that'll give us some context.
Sorry, are you going ahead, Rebecca, or I didn't catch the order you just suggested?
Oh yeah, I didn't catch the order either. I'm sorry if I was supposed to go ahead. So how am I, okay, so I started out my sort of research career thinking about technology, thinking about music listening, thinking about ways in which, we have so much more access on account of all these and portability of our musics. And so I really started thinking about ways in which that should have an impact on pedagogy. And so as a result of that book, I continued to think about the ways in which those technologies are having an impact on who we are as youths. And just thinking about sort of like, yes, our listening practices are changing, but we are changing as well. And so you can kind of see that thread in my paper, that it's this sort of like exploration of how like the teenage experience might be changing. I really think it dovetails really nicely with Katie's sort of memoir. I just like the way in which there's a potential here that sort of the ways in which your generation sort of like it all got sped up, right? So we have this like you experienced it and then you have this nostalgia for it in a period of like, I don't know how many years, but maybe 10 years or shorter. And so then I was thinking, okay, so maybe the generation I'm looking at is kind of like just kind of a new thing, and maybe related to the ways in which technology is much more manipulative than like maybe our generation or your generation, that there's sort of a shift here that's happening. So I'd love to hear from you, Katie, if maybe we can disrupt the flow for just a bit.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Our presentations serendipitously have a lot to say to each other. I'm Katie, I'm a music critic and an essayist, a memoirist, which is kind of the lens through which I presented my topic. My paper is Memory and Arrested Development of the So-Called Emo Revival, and sort of centers around the emo revival around the year 2016, when there were sort of all of these 10 and 15 year anniversary tours by third wave emo bands and reunions, and the sort of prematurity of that nostalgia as it struck me as a person who was still in her 20s. And this was sort of my formative music. And so thinking about the ways that third wave, like emo of the early aughts, was sort of like inherently teenaged or youthful in its expression, even more so in particular ways than other forms of pop music that have been important to youths of various times, basically because of burgeoning internet and social media sort of making the fan artist relationship and discoverability more porous, leading to a breakdown of sort of traditional record industry protections for said bands. And the expression in emo being sort of immature in its very sonic expression, right? and thinking about how that is reflected by the premature nostalgia of people in their late 20s, early 30s, and there being a market for this sort of revival tour. And I took the occasion of it was I was working as a music critic in Denver, and there was emo night, which is still going on. It's still, I think, a popular music party night that is based in LA, and not having the sort of trappings of my emo t-shirts to wear to this event. And then also thinking about a good friend of mine who that I grew up with and shared this music with, who suffered an accident in 2008 and is unable to form new short-term memories. And so thinking about the ways that we sort of recycle and exist in our past continuously as connected to the very particular music of my youth. But I was so interested in what you were saying, Rebecca, about the different sorts of nostalgia and the gradations. And as much as I try to stay away from generational trend pieces, I think that you were really getting at something in the difference between the way Gen Z artists are expressing nostalgia and the way people just a little bit older than them are in pop. So, thanks.
Just want to remind everyone that we are halfway through, so we have 15 more minutes.
Olivia, I'd love to hear how you came to your topic.
Thanks. Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were still going down the line, so I was giving it a second. So I've been thinking about, I think I've come to my topic from the perspective of a very disgruntled student, kind of like thinking about my own youth and the kind of curriculum that I encountered as someone growing up in Central Washington in particular, which is a predominantly, the place I'm from is a predominantly Latina or Latinx community. And so the work that I do is kind of creating the curriculum that I wished that I had as a student, things in a curriculum in which students have a lot of power and a lot of agency and pretty much have control over what's being taught. And a lot of kind of that reciprocity with me about being able to respond to them. So my interest in a responsive teaching practice is really rooted kind of selfishly in my own frustrations as a student. But the use of music in that curriculum is something that I try and promote, obviously, as much as possible, the kind of possibilities that lends, especially in the context of working with students who are perhaps reluctant readers or reluctant writers. I teach a lot of developmental writing classes. So music as a topic that, as an object, as a text that students are already so used to reading, whether or not they're aware of those reading practices, it's just something that's really immediate. And so in the context of creating like a narrative, like a mixtape, and I think of it as a narrative, as a story that students are assembling, it's something that they already know how to do, and I don't have to teach it. So there's a lot of that immediacy and intimacy that is just kind of already made within that narrative that they create. I'm actually, a bunch of them are incoming right now for my fall students, which I'm really excited about. But yeah, so I come to it as a student wanting to create something that I wish that I had, I guess. And and there's a question. Yeah, is there ever reluctance from students intimidated by the idea of writing about music? There's a lot with that particular assignment. There's a lot of, not necessarily reluctance, but kind of like panic about what to pick, how to pick it, how to put it together. I think sometimes, especially when we're in the face-to-face context, like a fear of judgment. Are you all going to judge my really, especially older students? Are you going to judge my choice of music, or no one's going to know who this song is? And I think I try and get students to lean into that they're creating something new, they're creating something that's instructive for other people, right? You're helping expose people to something that they haven't maybe encountered before. So I wouldn't call it reluctance, but there is a healthy amount of anxiety that I work with. But yeah, so that's kind of how I come at it. I think it's Michael next.
So Olivia's presentation segues perfectly into mine. First of all, how many people here are familiar with the band Nirvana? Okay, that's good, that's good. So my presentation advances the theory that Kurt Cobain's so-called mixtape that he made as a teenager, I believe in 1987, is actually has agency. It's not a lark, an experiment, or a goof. It has real agency. And how I discovered that, or that what led to my theory, was a 2013 trip I took to Mexico City to search for the writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And events occurred while I was down there that led to this deep dive. And so that's basically what my presentation tries to portray in moving images.
I just wanted to clarify, Michael, you did the video part of that, right?
I picked found footage pieces, and a buddy of mine, Alex, did a great job editing it all together, stitching it together for me. So
I guess
that's pretty much that.
And I think I'll just answer Maya's question. I have been working on a project about sentimentality and sentimental songs for a while now. And one of the things that I became kind of curious about in looking at kind of 19th century work on sentimental songs is that this material is often used kind of or discussed synonymously with the idea of the parlor song. And I think in kind of using that terminology in music studies, we tend to sometimes, I think, unwittingly reinscribe the kind of separate spheres ideology that has been critiqued within history. And so the idea that that these parlor songs are always existing in the private domestic sphere and they're gendered as feminine, the idea of the piano girl gets kind of tied up with the idea of the parlor song. But many of these songs circulated in spaces well outside of the parlor and were used in kind of public settings and were created by women working in, or young women or girls doing very much kind of public work, public political work in ways that really, I think, unsettle or untether some of those strong associations with the separate spheres ideology. So that's where I'm kind of working with that material. And yeah, so this is part of a chapter on 19th century sentimental songs and their production in public, use in public, and also their kind of creation by a lot of sentimental men.
I just saw a question in the chat, if it's okay if I go ahead and answer that, from Carl. Great question, I love this question. The answer is not yet, although there have been mentions in some of the fan club newsletters I've looked at where, you know, there'll be a goodbye letter, like saying goodbye to our president because she's going off, she's either going to college or she's starting a new job or something. I haven't found one specifically saying she's going off to work for Modern Screen, although there's a note in my paper from an editor from Modern Screen saying that they have a lot of fan clubbers working from them now. But that's actually kind of a next step I'm working on, is I want to kind of find more archives from Modern Screen now, in addition to the fan-made materials, to kind of see if I can find those connections. That's a great question, thanks.
And I just wanted to thank everyone for indulging in my question. It's so nice to be on a panel with all of you and your interesting work. I do not come from a music background at all. I'm a professor in French studies, and my background's in linguistics. And so I just kind of, this life experience sort of popped into my lap when I was working on an academic book on migration and language. And so Alvenia was my roommate, and that's how I came across it. And so for me to tell her story, it's been really important for me to learn from others. How do we approach these life histories that are so steeped in music history, right? And so I'm an ethnographer by training, so I'm really interested in artifacts and cultural history, but being in conversation with all of y'all has been fascinating to think about the importance of music in life histories. Yeah.
Can I ask Maya, what sort of work and what role did Alvenia Bridges play, like when she was on tour working with these different artists?
Yeah, so she was tour manager
Oh, wow.
for both Roberta Flack and then the Rolling Stones. And then, so she was working with the Stones in the early 80s, and then they sort of had their hiatus. And so then she was Mick Jagger's personal business liaison. So she, answered to him basically. And so she got to work on his first solo album. And that's why she has, the platinum and gold records hanging up in her. And then she worked heavily with Bill Graham. And so things like Live Aid, she was there for. The missile disarmament with Russia in '86, she was there for that. So she just kind of bopped around in different spheres in the rock and roll industry.
I was just thinking about our overarching topic is archives of youth, and we've mentioned all of these different ways of recording or holding on to memory and the music in this way. And I wondered for Ms. Bridges, being so influential behind the scenes, were there any particular archives that were most meaningful to her or are still most, is it the photos or recordings of concerts or the records themselves?
I would say any memorabilia that has a very specific meaning to her, right? So like she has this she's the boss letter jersey that Mick made for her with her name on it, and so she will take it out and show it off. And because she had a very special relationship with Mick, because he gave her a chance in this industry that was very male dominated. And then the photos with her and Bill Graham, because he was another person who did not think that she would be able to pull it off. And then when she proved she could, he had the utmost respect for her. So anything with sentimental value more than anything that has, I don't know, clout or something like that.
I think if it's okay, Eric had a question about the playing on my video, and yes, it was me. I did not play and sing at the same time because I can't do that, and I'm not trained as a vocalist, so I tend to learn, you could probably tell, I tend to learn most of the 19th century songs that I write about, because a lot of them you just can't find renditions of them, and I find it helpful to think through the material by kind of inhabiting it. And then I think the follow-up question was about like the kind of politics of it. And some of the music from the 19th century is not music that I want to inhabit or learn. So I try to avoid that, but it's in a lot of ways kind of inevitable. So I would learn to play it, but not actually choose to perform it.
Okay, and I think that is a good note to end our discussion here. So, and yes, from Carl Wilson echoing, it's really challenging to hold a discussion with 7 people on a panel with quite varied material. And so, but you know, here we are. And thanks to everyone. And you know, put your social media handles in the chat. And now we have a 30-minute break ahead of us until the next panel at 12:45. So thanks everyone, that went by very quickly.